Hey everybody, it's Blake from Steampunks, finally coming back at you again with a full review. It's been way too long and I've been hoping to get a lot more of these out in the future. Anyway, today we're going to be taking a look at Pyre. Pyre is the third game to come from SuperGiant, an independent game developer comprised of some industry veterans, most notably Greg Kasavin, a video game critic who found some success as a writer for these independent projects. It follows in the footsteps of their previous two narrative-driven RPGs, Bastion and Transistor, though this time they've doubled down on the storytelling, adding visual novel-style gameplay elements. I don't want to give away too many specifics of the story, as the narrative is one of the core experiences of this game, but there is a bit of context that does need to be covered. The game takes place in a mystical yet treacherous land known as the Downside, a destination for anybody who's exiled from polite society, otherwise known as the Commonwealth. Finding yourself face down in the desert, you're quickly rescued from certain demise by a humble nomad named Hedwin and his fellow travelers, Ruki and Jodariel. You pledge your loyalty to the trio, serving them as their reader. Literacy is apparently illegal in the Commonwealth, and this is the cause of your banishment. You quickly learn that your group is known as the Nightwings, and that your only hope at freedom is to participate in these ancient competitions known as the Rites between other traveling groups. The Nightwings' first concern is following a deliberately vague set of instructions to find a man known as Sandalwood, a mystical forest being that is wise to the ways of the Rites and the Downside. The group relies on you, the reader, to guide their journey, as you not only possess the rare ability to read words, but also the stars in the sky. While the story places a nice focus on your party rather than yourself, the narrative is a standard hero's journey and is easily outshone by the world build and the character design. The world feels vast and full of diverse creatures and terrain, and the lore that acts as the backbone feels very rich. It's very apparent that a lot of time and care was put into crafting a believable fantasy world for you to lose yourself in. The character writing is particularly good as well. Everyone is distinct and fairly well-rounded. You'll likely find yourself picking one of your own favorites as you continue through the adventure, and to me the mark of good writing is when a game actually makes you care about its characters. The narrative itself can feel a bit one-track minded and moving towards a certain goal at times, though with the way the game is set up I suppose that is a little hard to avoid. There are no real huge twists to the story, though there are enough interesting plot points and reveals to keep you wanting to find out more. Unfortunately, that feeling starts to get stale around halfway through the game, as your quest's reliance on repetition doesn't really give much room for new storylines to develop. Instead, relationships with friends and adversaries that were established in the first act are expanded upon. Given the storyline, it's clear that the game revolves around leading your band of explorers on their journey in their wagon through the Downside. You're depended upon to lead your friends to each rite, repeating certain sets of actions to get you to each destination. During these travels, you're given several minor choices, usually which way to take in a branching path, and these choices grant you small advantages or handicaps depending on what transpires. The game relies upon repeating this cycle of actions, choosing the star to follow, finding your way on a small branching path, reading dialogue between yourself and the characters in your crew, and preparing for the upcoming conflict, and finally, competing in the rite. Ultimately, this design leads to some pacing issues that might not sit well with some people. The first act of the game pushes you through so much new territory and introduces you to so many new characters and plot elements that the repetitive design isn't terribly noticeable. But once you've completed the first few hours and there isn't much new to introduce in the way of characters or environments, the repetition inherent in the game's framework becomes much more apparent. Your pilgrimage in the first act takes you across the game's entire world, consequently making it feel like the game has shown you every novel idea it's had in its first quarter. There's certainly more interacting with dialogue between characters than there is the action-oriented 3v3 orb gameplay, which is not necessarily a bad thing at all, but it does mean that you'll have to enjoy reading or be quite patient if you want to actually complete this game. Dialogue that alludes to this world's lore is highlighted and shows you a brief annotation giving you a quick context for the locations, people, or legends that your characters are referring to. This system works well, but it almost works too well, as the game relies on it heavily to relay a lot of the information about the world of Pyre. Sometimes a dialogue sequence will occur where you're being introduced to so many details in such a rapid and offhand fashion with these annotations that you sometimes just stop caring about reading all of these offhand bits of information just so you can take in the main story for what it is. A book of rites can also be found in your party's wagon, acting as a repository for all information about the game's mythology, though I wouldn't find it surprising if many players skip over reading a lot of this. Unfortunately, the design choice of confining a huge chunk of writing to one location usually results in players feeling less interested in taking in the material. Outside of reading dialogue and interacting with menus, the action part of the game takes the form of a 3-on-3 competition in which each team tries to extinguish the other's pyre by dousing its flames with the orb. It's an extremely bizarre form of conflict for a story-heavy RPG, but the gameplay here is actually quite refined and grows to become a much deeper experience than the initial impression you may get from it. Each of the 8 playable races has their own playstyle, each with their own modes of movement and attack. Characters can gain experience and level up on skill trees in a traditional fashion, and can get further buffs from a held talisman. You can even take each character to their own special training rite when they're ready, and unlock a talisman specifically designed for them. After completing the first act, your path opens up from a linear set of choices to being able to fly around in your wagon to the destinations of your choice. This could have been a lot more interesting, but it essentially just acts as connective tissue between the game's major elements. Another component that certainly gives the game its own identity is the art direction, which is truly unique and splendidly beautiful. The color implementation is masterful, everything looks like it was crafted with such high attention to detail, and the imagery comes together almost like one harmonious painting. Characters and objects typically aren't defined with hard black lines and instead fit neatly together and rely on excellent color contrast and detail to stand out. The designs aesthetically complement each character very nicely. Even if they do build off of established fantasy genre tropes, it is usually done in an intriguing way. The soundtrack is absolutely superb and one of the most standout parts of the game. The subtle orchestration and gentle use of strings, backed by the punchy drums and sometimes even spacey synthesizers, give the game so much of an atmospheric and dreamy texture that it's difficult to imagine the experience without it. The audio design overall is just excellently done. The sound effects are abundant and give a gritty realness to this illustrated world. The implementation of this soundtrack and the audio work is done so brilliantly. Each song and sound is carefully chosen to set a particular mood for a scene or a character, and no track feels out of place. While Pyre certainly does have its issues, mostly regarding pacing and its repetitive nature, the end result is a carefully crafted and highly polished indie title. I don't think the whole experience would have been nearly as enjoyable if all the pieces didn't come together so cohesively. This is a game that's definitely worth checking out if you're into games with great soundtracks, great atmospheres, characters, artwork, but it's certainly not for the type of player that wants instant gratification. Thanks for watching, and if you like this, be sure to check out more of our other reviews or any of our other content on our channel. Be sure to let me know what you thought about Pyre in the comments down below.